Welcome in, along with Eric Eager. I'm Steve Palazzolo. Today talking quarterbacks and more specifically quarterback clustering. And it's essentially PFF's way of just putting quarterbacks into tiers and just saying, all right, these are the best guys, these are the mid-tier guys, these are the worst guys. But they all have specific attributes, and you guys can find those tiers or clusters all in the PFF QB Annual. It's a part of your PFF Edge or Elite subscription. You guys can go check that out and follow along there. But I want to ask Eric, because you put all the numbers into this, you ran all the numbers on this, what exactly went into putting these quarterbacks into clusters or tiers?
Yeah, most of it is Pro Football Focus grades, so the percentage of positively graded throws they have, the percentage of big-time throws they have, the percentage of turnover-worthy plays. But we also have things like yards per attempt, air yards per completion, those types of things that we embed in there to put a little bit of like the style of play that a quarterback has.
So essentially what's happened over the years is we have all of this PFF data, and I've always had a million questions, and you come in and you can kind of run the numbers on these things and help answer my questions, which is great. And so part of the question I always ask you and the guys that are running numbers is, which parts matter the most? What is most stable? What things do we use the most? So is that essentially what went into determining those variables?
Absolutely. So one of the things you want to look at is, as you said, stability. So things like the percentage of negatively graded throws a quarterback has is really stable. The percentage of like negative 0.5 graded throws, very stable. So we think about those, and that's why those are in there. But we also look at how important doing different things are. So for example, positively graded throws, the percentage that a quarterback throws, correlates with success offensively more than almost every variable. So we include that in there as well, even though it's not quite as stable. And when we gather all those things together, we get a pretty decent indication of not only what how good the quarterback is, but what kind of quarterback he is and what kind of impact he had on his team.
When I look at the importance of each variable individually, PFF grade per snap, it comes in number one by a significant margin. Why is that?
I mean, I think we put so much context into it. I mean, you guys that grade the games, you guys know that the process that goes into being a good quarterback is more than just something like yards per attempt or air yards per attempt or whatever, right? So I think that that's really a testament to what you guys do analyzing games.
All right, so let's get into the clusters themselves. We've come up with 6 clusters, and each cluster of quarterback essentially has its own defining set of characteristics. So let's start with cluster 1. Essentially, we could call it the elite group if we were throwing names on this. These are the best quarterbacks, and give me an example of who's sitting there in cluster 1 as in this elite group of quarterbacks.
I mean, Tom Brady is probably the one, prototype for this group, a guy that, throws a lot of positively graded throws, a lot of big-time throws, limits turnover-worthy plays, can go downfield, can throw short, basically everything you want in a quarterback he can do.
So cluster 1, Tom Brady, only 3 quarterbacks were in cluster 1 in all of 2017. And then clusters 2 and 3 are the interesting ones. If you guys go to profootballfocus.com, or if you do have the QB Annual, you can see the specifics here. Clusters 2 and 3, from a skill set standpoint, they're different, but from how well did they play standpoint, they're similar. Is that right?
Yeah, so cluster 2 would be a quarterback that throws the ball sort of underneath, kind of limits variance a little bit, and that's somebody like Alex Smith, who, again, I think from the perception standpoint, threw the ball downfield more successfully last year, but as his characteristic is very much a low variance player, whereas cluster 3 is more of those, Jameis Winston, Deshaun Watson, the type of players that have a lot of positively graded plays and a lot of negatively graded plays, and they sort of like mush together, and on average, they're the same as a cluster 2 guy, but the way it's composed is different.
So those cluster 3 guys, they're some of my favorite guys to watch, because those are the guys I feel like we have the biggest debate. Really, all cluster 2 and 3 guys, we have the biggest debates about these guys. Do you want the safe guy, or do you want that highly volatile quarterback? Those cluster 3 volatile quarterbacks through the years, Carson Palmer, Cam Newton, Jameis Winston's been cluster 3 his entire career, and then Deshaun Watson last year, right? To the perception of the fans, you see a lot of those big plays, you see a lot of the special plays, but you also see a lot of the boneheaded decisions and the misses. Comparing those guys to the safer guys like Alex Smith, to me, that is like the best group to compare, just because it's 2 completely different skill sets, but they're at a similar level of production.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with from a success standpoint how good your team is. So Drew Brees has been a cluster 1 or 2 guy his whole career. You put a great team around Drew Brees, they're going to be pretty successful and pretty, I think, easy to predict, right? Whereas guys like Winston, they're going to have high ceilings, but also low floors. So you're going to get some 2016 Buccaneers teams and some 2017 Buccaneers teams.
All right, so what happens when we get to clusters 4 and 5? Another similar comparison between the two here?
Yeah, they're basically weaker versions of clusters 2 and 3, respectively. So, for example, cluster 4, Joe Flacco is somebody who I think we watched a Super Bowl run, we think of as high variance, but actually over the course of the last few years, he's become somewhat of a low variance and somewhat low output kind of guy.
Very conservative the last couple of years. Yeah. On our a couple of our other videos, we've mentioned the fact that he has been checking down more than anyone else. He had the highest percentage of checkdowns in the NFL last season, and he's not the same guy that was just chucking it down the field, letting Anquan Boldin make plays. So it actually makes sense that he is in the lower version of the safe quarterbacks in recent years.
Yeah, and for cluster 5, for example, we have a guy like Cam Newton who, as you can see with high variance, can be the MVP of the league 2 years ago, but when you lead the league in passes overthrown, those kinds of things, you can have kind of those low variance seasons. And for him, he has the running aspect, which we don't include in our analyses. But from a thrower's perspective, he can be anywhere from like cluster 1 to cluster 5 or 3, but he's kind of in that high variance category.
Yeah, so he essentially had a bad year in his highly volatile style of play. Right. And then cluster 6, this is essentially the opposite of the elite quarterbacks, right?
Yeah, so these are just guys that are perform poorly. So, for example, last year, Jay Cutler coming out of retirement, even though I think his actual passer rating was fine, on a grade level was not particularly strong. Guys like C.J. Beathard, for example, would also be in that group, and they're just players who simply struggled sort of in all aspects.
Just to wrap up all of this and what it actually means, what have you found as far as 1 year versus the next year, and where do guys stack up? If they're cluster 1 year, what are they looking like for the next year and subsequent seasons?
Yeah, what's really nice, so you throw cluster 6 out, because those guys often don't start consecutive years, but if you throw cluster 6 out, the plurality of each of the subsequent seasons, you stay in the same cluster. So a plurality of individuals in cluster 1 stay in cluster 1, 2 stays in 2, or also goes to 4, 4 to 2, 3 and 5, kind of those match together as well. But what's really nice is that these are pretty stable from the year-to-year perspective. If you're in one cluster, odds are you're going to stay in that cluster.
All right, be sure to check out the entire breakdown in the PFF QB Annual. It's all a part of PFF Edge or Elite. It's also on ProFootballFocus.com. Go check out PFF QB Clustering. It's our way of sorting quarterbacks into tiers. Be sure to check out the rest of all of our great PFF content here on the YouTube channel, and please give us that little thumbs up saying that you like this video.